Hello, my name is Evelyn Jackson, and today we'll be discussing the Impressionist movement, but especially through the lens of Claude Monet. I'll be using ClioVis to map out the progression of his life and the influence that he had on Impressionism. To begin, Claude Monet was born in Paris, France in 1840. Both of his parents were also born in Paris. Once he was old enough, he began to study at different schools. He had a great passion for art, despite his father wanting him to go more into the merchant business like he was. And he began to learn how to paint landscaping during this time. He went to a school that was in his hometown, but he eventually moved on to Paris to go ahead and study more complex art and be able to learn, especially from mentors who were already successful in different fields of art. He studied at the Académie Suisse, and this was more of a collective group. It allowed artists to come to this shared space and view muses and just learn from each other. Actually, during this time, he met his muse a few years later, who was Camille. Camille ended up marrying Monet years later, and they had two children together. She was the muse of a lot of his most famous works, including The Woman in the Poppy Fields and The Woman in a Green Dress, which was one of his most notable works, especially during this time. It kickstarted a little bit of his career. It showed just him using different ways that light was hitting her dress, creating shadows, using bright colors, which is something that usually wasn't happening. He also made this a smaller scale painting compared to works that we would see later in his career. It was during this time, a few years later, that the Impressionist movement really kicked off. They weren't getting a lot of traction with their art, primarily because it was different. It used bright colors, it highlighted how light affects different landscapes at different times. And so this society was founded who would display their art and host Impressionist exhibitions. It was at this first exhibition that the Impression Sunrise by Monet was featured, and that is really what highlighted a lot of the Impressionist movement because it gained so much traction and popularity in the art community for its bright colors, which is pictured here. Unfortunately, in 1979, Monet's wife, Camille, passed away, and this brought Monet a lot of grief, a lot of pain, and he actually painted this portrait of her on her deathbed, which was really famous for its quick brush strokes because he was just trying to capture the moment so that he could remember her and honor her in her last moments. And it was just a piece that drew a lot of emotion out of his audience, even though it was something that was actually for him and to help with his mourning. After his wife died, he moved to Giverny, France, which he moved with his lover at the time, Alice. Him and Alice had been seeing each other, and she had kids herself. But when he moved there originally, he began to rent what would later become his home that he would buy. But since he didn't have the funds, he could only rent this place, but he would eventually transform it into his famous water gardens. But shortly after the move, the last Impressionist exhibit did happen. There were a lot of differences within the group, a lot of arguments about how the Impressionist group should proceed. People were beginning to develop their own art styles that weren't always coinciding with each other, and it just naturally fizzled out. This gave Monet a lot more freedom. He was already starting to decrease his activity in that society, but he began building his water lilies garden. Monet was a fanatic about gardens and about just wildlife and plants. He loved painting flowers, which is seen across many of his different paintings, not just the water lilies, especially poppy fields and just different paintings like that. He had a sunflowers painting. But this was what he considered his great prized art in life, was that he built these water gardens, which would later turn into two series of his work. The first series had only 25 canvases, but at the finale, he had 250 total canvases. However, he began to lose his eyesight, which left him to have less defined strokes as seen here. And he unfortunately died at 86. But his work was displayed in this museum.